It's okay to drop something. I know that consuming media can be an emotionally engaging process that varies for a multitude of different people, but it's okay to admit, be it to yourself or other people, that something isn't for you, whether immediately or gradually over time. I know that showing dedication and passion towards these franchises have led to an entire culture of commemoration, hence why fandom continues to thrive today, be it on the World Wide Web or in person at places like conventions. But sometimes that said commemoration, on an individual level, doesn't last forever. And I've discussed this previously, but depending on what you're being exposed to and when, one day you may be foaming at the mouth for one thing, and the next day, perhaps it'll be something else coming in to take its place. It's not to say that you're going to forget your previous experiences with other franchises and throw them away like they were nothing, but what takes you so far as to say, I'm done? Or what does it take to reignite interest after said interest was lost? My thoughts on the subject are admittedly a little scattered, but that's why I'm here today, to turn that scatteredness into something a little more coherent, with specifics injected into this conversation. Speaking of specifics, let's start off the very reason I subconsciously began to craft this video in my head in the first place, months ago. There are many other franchises out there I'd associate between things I've categorized in my head as, and I quote, I just don't care anymore, I just can't get enough, and you won me back. Of all the footage to select for these three specific categories, why put these three franchises in the spotlight specifically? Well, to start with something like Star Wars, it's something that's been with me for a long time since my early days in my childhood. There were many times over the years that I could not stop thinking about Star Wars, and it just completely take over my life one way or another. Nowadays, I just can't get into it like I once did, no matter how hard I try. And I don't love it like I once did anymore. So I decided to stop consuming Star Wars content altogether and drop the series. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's Persona. I've gotten into it very recently in the past few years, and honestly, I currently, keyword currently, cannot get enough of it. When I think I'm done and I'm closing the curtains on some of its contents it's offering me, every time it pops up, I'm ecstatic, and excitement fills every fiber of my being. Even now I still want more. Lastly, there's Resident Evil. Like Star Wars, this series has also been with me for a long time. And just like Star Wars, there was a point where I started to lose interest, and I honestly didn't want to play it anymore. That was 12 years ago. But as the years went by, my interest in the franchise began to revive itself, little by little, until fully taking on new life as it continued to thrive once more. Needless to say, even if it might be a little while until the next one, I am 100% on board to keep following along as a hardcore fan like I once did 2010 and prior. What pushes me to lose interest in something in general? For something like Star Wars, I think it boils down to a few things. The series itself overindulging on content output, myself pushing back on said output, the quality of the content, and my interests continuing to metamorphosize as time goes on. It's not to say that I wish to put anyone's archived or upcoming Star Wars related work to shame, since I'm sure there's people that love those iterations and people that will still go bananas for the content that's being finalized for release. And to those people I say, I'm happy for you, and I hope it continues to be everything you want. The biggest sign for me when choosing to highlight Star Wars in this particular category is, I've noticed that things I should be excited for don't really generate a buzz for me at all, even if somewhere deep down I know it should. Look, I get it. I could pick and choose the content to get into, since technically I'm not required to know it all. But my admitted stubbornness has me stay out of it regardless of quality, since I'd rather spend my time with other franchises now. Hell, a few years back, even if I wasn't 100% on board with the quality of the content that was presented, the only reason I was ever engaged at all was because said content was spread out by a few years. Nowadays, it feels like there's content just seemingly ready all the time, and I'm not willing to keep up with its frequency. It's just too much for me, and I was never built for said frequency. And that doesn't have to do with just Star Wars. That goes for everything. The general rule of thumb for me is, if there's too much to get into, especially if there's so much in the production funnel at once, I can't exactly tag along and keep up. It's not to say that you can't find good moments within franchises that seemingly never know when to close the curtains, but overexposure does factor into how I view or treasure a franchise over time. Even if I wanted to get into all of these series offered by a franchise like Star Wars, it already feels like something else is on the way, and I won't have enough time to really appreciate it before moving on. And hell, I'm not 100% certain if, due to the mass output of content, if people even remember certain spin-offs from a few years ago. But it's alright. If one franchise doesn't do it for me anymore, then there will always be another. I won't ruin anyone else's love solely because I have no love for it anymore. Nor will I make the assumption that everyone in general likes and dislikes the same things I do. After all, it wouldn't be integral as a YouTuber to believe that everyone thinks the same way I do, or force people to believe what I believe. Let's talk about my metamorphosizing interests, or rather, my changed willingness to get into new things. Previously, even if I knew I wanted to get into new things all the time, those motivations to even remotely try something new just kept being drowned out because I'd end up right back where I started by just going with something I know instead. In my own head, I remember thinking, why would I go with something new when the old nostalgic stuff will still generate a buzz all the time and keep me entertained forever, guaranteed? Even now, I wish I had all the time in the world to open up the floodgates and let in everything so I can just get through the backlog already. But I can only pick and choose things bit by bit, and I'm not going to have time for everything, even if I wanted to. And sometimes I'm still not successful. I only have a little bit of time to enjoy something and soothe my nerves from a long day. So that's what leads me back into something nostalgic, since I know I'll love it, and I ain't afraid to admit that nostalgia does offer that guaranteed form of serotonin. I could be overthinking it, but when that does happen, I don't feel as explorative as I should be. One could say, but you have an opportunity to explore something new. Shouldn't that get you excited and make you look forward to something after you're done for the day? That's very true, and I do try to give myself those chances more often, hence why I was able to finally get into the Persona series in the first place. But sometimes the best way to unwind, I found, is to tread backwards temporarily before I'm ready to move forward once more. Now, you might be wondering, hang on a minute, Persona games are super long. How could they capture your attention if you don't like getting into super long series? I mentioned previously my stubbornness to stay away from Star Wars. That same stubbornness applies to the things I'm super into, and I admittedly don't want to let go of them, which is something I once felt with Star Wars, but now transferred over to a series like Persona. Coming back to my personal rule of thumb, despite a franchise like Persona giving over 100 hours of content per game, its releases are currently still spread out enough to where appreciation for those entries can have room to breathe, instead of being drowned out by something that's due around the corner. In general, I'm much more inclined to lean towards those franchises that don't have as much content output, but make their time count upon their release. And some out there are just one and done phenomenon, zapped into a singularity, untouched by the expansion of sequel production, so I'd have to put in even more effort to cherish its existence. Sometimes I do admittedly miss those times that have come and gone with franchises I used to consume on a regular basis, but new times means new experiences, so it's best to just go with the flow and enjoy said new experiences. I'm never going to be perfect at this, but I keep trying to add more things to my personal entertainment library as often as I can, while appreciating everything that's passed. And that includes the things I've dropped and lost interest in. Even if I don't appreciate or love something like I once did, I'm willing to eventually embrace the possibility of regaining my interest once again. And that's where something like Resident Evil came in. Just like Star Wars, I was in love with it for the longest time as a kid, and then things started to change. Unlike Star Wars, however, Resident Evil in 2012 wasn't overindulging with releases, and the same is true today. So the change in quality and style versus older entries was much more apparent at the time. Whether or not people appreciate those changes will forever be a debate. But what got me the most was seeing Resident Evil start to course correct itself and bring itself back into the limelight it once had. Flash forward all these years later, and Resident Evil has since re-established its reputation as a beloved franchise, and if that momentum keeps up in the near future, Resident Evil will continue to stay on top. I won't forget the fact that just like myself with Star Wars, there may be people out there that disagree with the new direction that Resident Evil has gone through, and that too is completely valid. I said in the beginning that it's okay to drop something, but it's also okay to regain interest in something that you stopped being interested in once upon a time. And just like the former, the latter applies to everything in general. Times and the people that inhabit them may not forever remain in a perpetual state, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible to enjoy things like you once did. I've once said before that I view these libraries of media presented to me as multiple stations to visit and travel through. That's of course figuratively speaking, but the internet does make it feel like I'm blasting through these multiple worlds and stories, even if, in reality, I'm just sitting in my chair. That said, even if there's a station that I refuse to revisit, there's every possibility that I can pass through it again and become interested in it like I once did. If it happened before, it could certainly happen again. And who knows, it's entirely possible that I look at this video 5 years from now and something like Persona and Resident Evil no longer generates any interest, but Star Wars does once again, or there'll be something else entirely different. I know I can't do everything at the same time, and I wouldn't expect myself to, but little by little, if I keep going with the flow, it helps me remember that at the end of the day, entertainment should continue to remain fun, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Well, that's all for today. What did you think of what I discussed today? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Any additional nuances I may have missed regarding this topic? I'd love to hear it, so write it down in the comment section below and share your thoughts with me. Before ending today's video, I'd like to give a special thank you to Gem2475 for continuing to support me despite my substantially long absence. I know I've kept saying in the past that I've always wanted to maintain a regular video schedule, but that's admittedly still a work in progress. I believe I'm much closer to figuring it out compared to before, but I think I need to continue with more improvements if I want to accelerate those goals further. I really appreciate all of you. Thank you sincerely. Until next time, everyone, take care of yourselves and farewell.